Welcome to the start in a Legendarium series called Tales of Old Russia. We'll be starting off with a medieval zombie story. It is fair to say that medieval society was preoccupied with death, from the British Isles to the steppes of Eurasia. After all, this was a society where 50% of people didn't make it past the age of 15, and if you managed to make it through childhood and adolescence, chances are you wouldn't make it past the age of 40. Anybody who made it to the age of 50 was ancient indeed. This was a time when people would hold marketplaces and even festivals in the graveyards, when they built huge containers for the dead called ossuaries, which used bones and skulls and decorations. And it was a time when churches and civic buildings would be painted with images of the Dance of Death, where the Grim Reaper would lead skeletons on a merry dance to the next world. One of the best-known tales of the Middle Ages told of three young kings walking down the road, all dressed in flashy court fashions with sleeves long enough to sweep the floor, and pointed shoes so long they needed garters studded with jewels to hold them up. Those are based on actual medieval fashions, by the way. Then they encounter three dead men on the road. One is recently dead, stiff as a board. The other is bloating with rot and pus, and the third is a skeleton. And the three dead men tell the three living that they were living not long ago, and that they must mend their immoral ways, focusing more attention on being good Christians and less on being good fops. And as the three dead walk away, the three fops pledge to mend their wicked ways. Now, medieval people would have seen this as a happy story, an example of the dead helping the living. However, not all of the dead could be counted on to help you. One Russian folktale in particular focused upon an old woman of utter evil. Now, when we think of haggard old crones in the Middle Ages, we are likely to think about witches. And witches did indeed fly through the imaginations of medieval Europeans, but mainly in the West. Eastern Europe saw many fewer witch hunts, in large part because people were a lot more worried about vampires and revenants, what we today call zombies. It was the deeply held belief, both in Russia and across Eastern Europe, that the good and the just would rest in peace, while the evil would rise from their graves to torment the living in one way or another. This tale focuses upon Koma Brute, a young man who encountered one such of the evil dead. He lived in a village, the son of a peasant family, and as he attended his chores, he saw a withered, white-haired old woman coming at him. As she drew closer, Koma wanted to run away, but he couldn't move his arms or legs. He couldn't even scream, even as his heart pounded against his ribs. Cackling terribly, the old woman jumped upon Koma Brute's back, grabbed him tight, and then beat him with her broom. Screaming in terror, Koma ran through the village and then the plains and finally the woods, carrying the old woman on his back as he went. Finally, he realized that her soul swam in black magic, and instead of running, he fell to his knees and prayed. The power of God compelled the old woman to loosen her grip, and Koma slipped out from under her. He then jumped on her back, riding her like a horse, and finally he found a stick and beat her head in with it. As she fell to the ground, the witch turned into a beautiful young woman. Of course, Koma Brute was too shaken and frightened to notice that, so he simply returned home. However, the creature followed him into the village, limping and bloody, but still living. She entered the home of a rich man who was very wicked and drank deeply from the cup of greed. The witch asked the rich man to force Koma Brute to stay with her dead body for 3 nights in the church and read last rites. At first, the rich man refused, as he sensed a trick. However, he agreed when the young woman waved her hand and brought about a bag of gold coins out of thin air. And once she promised that bag of gold to the rich man, he readily agreed. So the rich man forced Koma Brute to spend 3 nights with the woman in the church where her coffin lay. And Koma Brute dared not refuse the rich man, as his parents owed the rich man money and they would be ruined if he called in their debts. It's worth noting that Russian culture did not see a problem with being poor. After all, Christ and his disciples had been poor. To the Russian peasant, being poor was a sign of virtue and goodness and godliness. On the other hand, a rich man was seen as wealthy only because he was greedy and corrupt and sucked the blood of honest, hard-working peasants. There were even stories of peasant families who shunned their sons because they chose to become rich merchants who worshipped money instead of God. During the first night, Coma Brute lit the candles in the church and regretted he could not smoke inside a house of God. Then he looked at the dead person, now transformed into a young woman, and he saw her tremendous beauty even in death. In time, he grew frightened by the stunning beauty of the dead woman. As his fear grew white-hot, she cried a tear of blood. Terrified, Coma began to read from the prayer book, but as he read, the young woman raised her head and sat up straight in the coffin, ready to take her revenge. As the dead woman approached him, Coma drew a magic circle around him and began to recite prayers. As long as he stood inside the circle, no servant of Satan could see him. For a time, the witch tried to find Coma Brute, but she found nothing. So, in time, she returned to her coffin, but in a final show of her power, she raised her coffin off the stone slab and flew it around the church. Though frightened, Coma Brute remained inside the church to keep his word both to his parents and their creditor. Dawn came, the day passed, and the second night of Coma Brute's ordeal began. Once more, Coma drew the magic circle around him and began reading out loud from the prayer book. He read for an hour before he grew tired and lit up a cigarette. This was a disrespectful gesture to a church in the Russian Orthodox tradition, and Coma would pay a terrible price for this transgression. Indeed, when he looked up at the coffin after smoking, he saw that the witch stood near the circle. The old woman shouted magic chants and invocations, and the sound of wings flapping and creatures hitting the church windows sounded, hoping to make Coma flee his magic circle in terror so that the witch and her demon minions could find him. For a whole night, Coma Brute stood trapped in the circle, unable to sit down, as all the powers of hell screamed for his blood, pounding on the windows, pounding on the walls, making such a racket that he was gripped by terror. And the terrible racket did not stop until the rooster crowed the end of the second night. And by the end, Coma's terror was so great that his hair turned snow white. Now, you've probably noticed by now the strange combination of Orthodox Church ritual and magic in the story. Not only does Coma Brute make use of prayer and holy books, but magic circles. Indeed, the religious life of the Russian peasant was a mix of Orthodox Christianity and pagan rites. Though famous for their piety, frequently crossing themselves and believing in miracles coming from saints' bones, up through the 1900s, Russian peasants still left sacrifices to pagan deities to protect them from the winter, and burned wooden men in rites to heathen gods. They prayed to the Christian God for salvation, but still prayed to forest gods and river gods to keep the harvest safe. This mix of Christian prayers and exorcisms, along with pagan incantations and warding circles, were used by Russians to fend off evil magic up through the 20th century. Pity it couldn't fend off their own government. In any case, on the third and final night, the creature rose from her coffin again. She spoke her invocations, and the icons hanging in the church fell to the ground. All the windows broke, and demons poured into the church. However, Coma Brute remained safe and invisible inside his magic circle. At last, the demons, determined to get the virtuous young Christian, invoked the name of V, the chief of all goblins. Soon enough, a small man covered in black earth appeared, his eyelids so long that they reached the floor with a face of iron. V commanded the other demons to lift up his eyelids with their hands so that he could see Coma. And once he did, Coma's blood ran cold. V raised an iron finger and pointed at the place where Coma stood so the demons would know where to attack. And as the demons approached, Coma collapsed of fright and died. And despite their victory over the good and pious young man, the goblins and demons could not triumph against the power of God. As they danced and celebrated the death of Coma Brute, the rooster crowed again, announcing the end of the third night. The demons knew that they must return to hell before God's light bathed the world. However, as they streamed out of the church, sunlight illuminated the world and turned all of them into stone. In time, the church would be abandoned by the villagers, and a forest was raised by God to hide the petrified demons and the casket of the witch, and it remained hidden to this day, with no one able to find it again. Now, this tells us something about Russian culture and attitudes. On the one hand, heroes are not guaranteed a happy ending, and the powers of hell are great indeed, not only to make life very hard, but probably make it very short. However, it also shows that they believed the power of God was ultimately supreme and would triumph over evil, just as they believed that their beloved Father Tsar would one day lay low the rich boyars who they believed sucked the blood of the poor, just as in the case of the rich boyar who forced Koma Brute to endure that 3-day ordeal. And that wraps things up for this first episode of Tales of Old Russia. I hope that you enjoyed it. If you liked what you saw, press like. If you want to see more, press subscribe. And if you've got anything to say, please leave it in the comments section. Thanks again for joining me. And next we'll be doing The Lost Library of the Tsars.